Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a high-stakes, ancient Chinese political thriller that honestly proves the dangers of toxic nepotism and unchecked wealth are as old as time itself. We're heading back to the Han Dynasty to look at a story overflowing with unimaginable wealth, unchecked ambition, and a fatal family promise that completely tore a royal house apart. By mapping out the historical records, we are going to see exactly how the mighty House of Liang rose to become the saviors of an empire, only to rot entirely from the inside out.
Okay, let's dive into this cold open. Consider this sentence, which is arguably one of the most disastrous ever spoken in ancient history. During a royal banquet, Emperor Jing of the Han Dynasty made this promise to his younger brother, Prince Xiao of Liang. He said, "After 1,000 autumns and 10,000 years," which, by the way, is just a very polite, poetic way of saying after I die, "the throne passes to you." Now, it was likely just a drunken, empty promise made in the heat of a festive moment. But to Prince Xiao and to their incredibly powerful mother, Empress Dowager Dou, it was a binding royal decree. This single passing sentence would ultimately ignite a bloody constitutional crisis and destroy a powerful dynasty. Section 1. The Golden Age and the Hero. Because before the fall, there was the rise. Prince Xiao, who was also known as Liu Wu, wasn't just an ambitious brother. He was a legitimate hero. When the massive rebellion of the Seven States threatened to overthrow Emperor Jing, it was Prince Xiao who held the line. He fortified his cities, he appointed brilliant generals, and he successfully blocked the rebel armies from advancing westward into the imperial heartland. He was, without a doubt, the savior of the Han Dynasty. As a reward for that intense loyalty, Emperor Jing granted Prince Xiao privileges that were essentially reserved for a co-emperor. Think about the terrifying scale of power he was allowed to accumulate. He governed over 40 major cities in some of the empire's most fertile lands. He built a network of palaces with elevated walkways stretching over 30 miles. He rode with imperial banners, was escorted by thousands of chariots, and held a private armory of hundreds of thousands of weapons. He practically ran a parallel emperor-like state right next door to the actual emperor. And with all that power came absolutely staggering wealth. Historical sources actually note that his treasury held hundreds of millions of cash coins, plus an astonishing 400,000 caddies of gold. His collection of pearls, jade, and precious treasures literally exceeded what the emperor himself had in the imperial capital. So Prince Xiao was richer than the emperor. If you really want to understand the root of his unparalleled level of hubris, this is it, right here. When you have this much money and this much military might, you start believing that any promise made to you is a promise you can enforce. Part 2. The fatal promise and the constitutional crisis. This brings us to a massive tipping point. All of this immense wealth and military glory collided disastrously with that drunken promise Emperor Jing made to pass him the throne. And crucially, this succession plan was heavily, heavily backed by their mother, Empress Dowager Dou, who definitely favored her youngest son. So, when Emperor Jing eventually deposed his current crown prince, the question of succession just blew up. This wasn't some petty family squabble. It was a profound ideological clash between ancient constitutional laws. The Empress Dowager argued for the ancient Shang dynasty law, which favored brother-to-brother succession based on close kinship. But the imperial ministers fiercely opposed this idea. They leaned hard on the Zhou dynasty law, which strictly favored primogeniture, meaning father-to-son succession, to ensure political stability. A really key figure here is Minister Yuan Eng. He vehemently warned the emperor and the Empress Dowager against making Prince Xiao the heir. He used historical precedent, specifically the tragic story of Duke Swan of Song, to argue that brother-to-brother succession always, without fail, results in generations of bloodshed, civil war, and total chaos, mainly because the nephews will eventually fight to reclaim the throne. Convinced by the rigid righteousness of Yuan Eng's argument, Emperor Jing appointed his own son as heir instead. Just like that, Prince Xiao's ultimate ambition was shattered, setting off a really deadly chain reaction. Section 3. The Bloody Backlash. Deprived of his promised throne, the celebrated hero of the Han Dynasty snapped. Prince Xiao's ambition violently morphed into deep paranoia, resentment, and an intense thirst for revenge against the ministers who blocked his path. 10. That is the number of high-ranking imperial ministers who were brutally assassinated in the streets of the capital, and among them was Minister Yuan Eng himself. Prince Xiao had actually hired thugs, specifically his own advisors, Yang Sheng and Geng Sun Gui, to carry out these hits. It was a shocking, brazen act of domestic terrorism orchestrated by a royal prince against his own brother's government.
This incredible act of terror triggered an extraordinary political cover-up. The investigation that followed was incredibly tense. First, the emperor's detectives traced a freshly forged sword left at an assassination scene right back to a blacksmith in Prince Xiao's kingdom. The gig was up. But here is where it gets crazy. When imperial envoys Tian Shu and Lu Jishu went to investigate, they uncovered the whole plot. Yet they realized that revealing the truth would force the emperor to execute his own brother. That would likely kill their mother, the Empress Dowager, out of pure grief, and probably plunge the whole empire into a civil war. So what do? They secretly burn the treasonous confessions. They officially blame only the advisors, who are then forced to commit suicide, allowing the emperor to temporarily clear Prince Xiao's name and keep the peace.
Even with the cover-up, the truth was obvious to the family. Prince Xiao actually had to smuggle himself into the capital in a plain carriage and dramatically throw himself before the emperor with a literal executioner's block, begging for mercy. Although they publicly wept and made this big show of forgiveness, the trust between the brothers was permanently broken. They never rode in the same carriage again. And then comes the bizarre, almost unbelievable ending for our fallen prince. Shortly after returning home, Prince Xiao witnessed what was considered a terrible omen. A cow born with a foot growing out of its back. Yeah, a literal mutant cow. Deeply disturbed and falling into a superstitious panic over this, he fell ill with a fever and died just 6 days later. A man of limitless wealth and power ultimately undone by a fever and profound disappointment.
Part 4. The Fall and Division. With the immensely powerful Prince Xiao dead, the dynamic of the empire shifted immediately. When the news finally reached the capital, the Empress Dowager was completely devastated. She went on a hunger strike, screaming that the emperor had essentially murdered her favorite son by breaking his heart. Emperor Jing was terrified by his mother's reaction, right? But he also saw a golden opportunity to neutralize the threat of Liang forever. To appease his mother, he didn't just pass the kingdom to Xiao's eldest son. Instead, he executed a brilliantly ruthless political maneuver. He sliced the massive, dangerous kingdom of Liang into 5 much weaker, separate states, giving one to each of Xiao's 5 sons. He framed it as an act of incredible generosity to his nephews, but strategically, he had completely dismantled the parallel state. The giant was cut into pieces.
Section 5. Generations of Decay. We have now reached the final act of our tragedy. The immense wealth of Prince Xiao was divided up among his descendants, but unfortunately, they lacked the discipline or purpose that built it in the first place. We are about to see how this inheritance completely rots the family from the inside out over the following decades.
Over just a few short decades, unchecked privilege turned into outright madness and petty crime. It's wild. King Ming of Jichuan was deposed after casually shooting and killing his own military commander. Kings Bushi and Ding both died relatively quickly without heirs, meaning their lands defaulted right back to the central government. And most horrifyingly, King Pengli of Jidong literally became a serial killer. He roamed the streets at night with gangs of youths, murdering over 100 people just for sport. He was deposed and his land was absorbed. The empire simply watched as the heirs of Liang totally self-destructed. And to truly show how far the mighty House of Liang had fallen, we have to look at their final disgrace. It wasn't some grand rebellion or a heroic last stand against the emperor. It was a pathetic, violent family squabble over a shiny antique. Prince Xiao's grandson, King Ping, and his grandmother, Dowager Li, got into a literal tug-of-war over a priceless heirloom called the Leizan Cup. It escalated into physical violence. We're talking smashed fingers, locked doors, and crazy palace intrigue. The scandal eventually drew imperial investigators who not only confiscated the cup, but also exposed deep moral decay within the household, including the dowager's incestuous affairs with palace officials. The central government used the whole embarrassing scandal to strip them of 8 more cities.
It is an incredible, almost cinematic arc, isn't it? From saving the empire and amassing unimaginable wealth to collapsing into a puddle of petty crime and family squabbles over a cup of gao. As we wrap up this explainer on the dangers of empty leadership promises and the toxic nature of nepotism without accountability, I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. Did the House of Liang fall simply because an emperor made a foolish, drunken promise he couldn't keep? Or was a kingdom built on such overwhelming, unchecked wealth always destined to destroy itself from within? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.